Welcome to a forthright column and commentary on a column published last week, triggered by the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. But first, a bit of personal background. As a 9-year-old, I was fascinated by pictures of how the earth moved and twisted in the photo coverage in Life magazine of the 1964 Good Friday earthquake in Anchorage, Alaska, a 9.2 moment magnitude quake. It was massive. In architecture school in the late 1970s, investigations into the Cascadia Subduction Zone were cutting-edge science, and design for seismic safety was just beginning to be adopted into building codes and building practices. In the 1980s, one of my first big projects as an architect was the renovation of the Spokesman Review building with its iconic tower in downtown Spokane. That building has been thoroughly seismic upgraded. There is a steel grid, a steel frame inside the west wall, holding that building, tying back into the elevator towers for safety. The tower itself on Riverside has a circular grid inside, tying it back down into the main building, and then again those forces directed back towards the elevator core. That was cutting edge structural design at the time, and if there's an earthquake in Spokane, I think I'd like to be in that building. In the 1990s, I volunteered for about 10 years with the Seattle King County Disaster Team as an EMT and architect to be along as a safety officer. Responded in 3 deployments, first for Hurricane Aniki on Kauai, the last one to the Atlantic Olympics as part of a secret standby in case of mass casualty due to weapons of mass destruction, and that's an entire story in itself. And the second deployment was to Santa Clarita, California, following the Northridge quake. The Northridge quake was only a 6.7 moment magnitude, and the damage was impressive and significant. And I was there for about a 5 point something aftershock. That was pretty impressive too. Hard to imagine what the shaking from a 9.2 would be like. So with that background into why my fascination with earthquakes and with my respect for the power of the earth to move under our feet, here is the column. Headlined, Earthquake in Turkey Should Shake States' Budget Priorities. Friday, February 10, 2023, in the Spokesman Review. That would never happen here, we tell ourselves as we watch aerial videos of collapsed buildings in Turkey and Syria. We have modern building codes. We don't have institutional corruption and code enforcement. We have highly skilled construction crews. All true, yet we are not ready for the shaking we know is coming. We've made trade-offs. According to a review completed in 2021 by the Department of Natural Resources, at the legislature's request, we have 800 school buildings across Washington in need of significant seismic upgrades. Schools built before 1960 are particularly at risk. The scope of the problem is documented in the School Seismic Safety Program study completed under the direction of DNR's chief hazards geologist with a team of structural engineers studying schools across the state. We have a significant inventory of infrastructure, including bridges and other publicly and privately owned buildings at risk as well, but schools are special. The pain felt by parents digging through rubble of collapsed schools is unimaginable. We saw it in reports from China's Sichuan province in 2008 and at a primary school in Mexico City in 2017. When an elementary school collapsed in Puerto Rico in December 2020, students and teachers were only saved by the Christmas holiday. Children are a priority in a healthy society. Communities also rely on schools for shelter and a base for emergency response. As the direct death toll from Turkey-Syria earthquake has risen, it was more than 20,000 as of Thursday morning before this column was printed. As of today, I just checked before I started recording, it's over 46,000. But as the death toll has risen, the threat of death from hypothermia has emerged. Many fear collapse in an aftershock more than they fear the cold. It seems obvious. We urgently need to protect our children and communities, but there are always limits of time and money. The legislature passed bipartisan Senate Bill 5993 last year to establish the School Seismic Safety Grant Program, which went into effect June 9th. According to testimony to the Senate Ways and Means Committee last September, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction estimated the cost of addressing seismic upgrades at approximately $700 million. But as anyone who has ever tackled a home remodeling project knows, There are always logical, while we're at it projects, as long as it's necessary to tear open roofs and walls to reinforce brittle or inadequate connections, then we might as well fix the electrical and mechanical systems. And as long as the place is torn up, now's the time to add a couple of classrooms and rearrange a few walls and add technology to the library and replace kitchen equipment and so on. So it's not a simple matter of deciding to spend $700 million next year to make schools safe. There's an entire process of school construction funding that assumes a regular pace of renovation, modernization, and new construction, with not all schools applying in one biennium and all requiring local matches. OSPI responded by email to a request for a status update on the seismic upgrade program with this statement, quote, OSPI has awarded planning grants through the School Seismic Safety Program to Tahola, Cape Flattery, Ocean Beach, and North Beach school districts. OSPI is ready to award construction grants to any district which has completed its construction planning process. This new program builds on the seismic retrofits of school buildings that the legislature funded in 2020, end quote. So like all public policies, there are trade-offs. OSPI has chosen to focus limited funding first on schools facing both earthquake and tsunami hazards, and then moving east and inland. As reported by the Seattle Times, the 2022 supplemental budget awarded $100 million to OSPI to begin funding retrofit projects, quote, down from the roughly $500 million included in the Senate's original proposal, end quote. A request for another $100 million is anticipated this biennium, continuing until all the projects are completed. OSPI has decided to incorporate seismic retrofits into the current funding sources using the well-defined processes for school projects, which means we will still have seismically vulnerable schools in Washington for the next 2 decades or more. It's logical, but it's a gamble. Earthquakes shake and tear the Earth's crust on a regular basis along the Pacific Rim. It's a question of when, not if, the Earth moves. Should we catastrophically lose the bet, logic will not assuage the anger and grief of parents clawing at a pile of rubble. With the clarity of hindsight, we'll question using normal funding processes over urgent action. Then Senator David Frocht, a Democrat of Seattle, a co-sponsor of Senate Bill 5933, challenged the piece at that September Ways and Means hearing, saying, we are far behind Oregon, California, and British Columbia on upgrading our schools. We need to get this thing going faster. Upgrading in less time would require more money now, either by making it a capital budget priority or borrowing outside the current limits. Governor Jay Inslee's proposal to increase Washington's debt limit by $4 billion to fund an also urgent need for affordable housing is unlikely to pass voter muster. But those same voters may be okay with borrowing a mere $700 million to upgrade all of Washington's schools on a fast track. What's happening now in Turkey can happen here. We can hope time is on our side, proceed decently and in order, and risk more lives, or we can choose to act quickly and risk feeling foolish. It's a trade-off. So that was the end of the column. In preparation for the column, I listened to the expert testimony given at that September meeting of the House Ways and Means Committee from an engineer and a construction manager reporting back to the legislature. And here's a paraphrase of that testimony captured as fast as I could type. From the structural engineer, he pointed out there are 4 variables in earthquake preparedness there and where the hazard comes from. There is seismicity, that's the shaking and subsiding of a building, or affects the shaking and subsiding. There's the tsunami inundation risk, Pacific Coast issue. There's site liquefaction, where there's wet spots underneath that can be a problem. And then there's the buildings themselves. So he described those in a little more detail. The seismicity potential shaking is moderate to low east of the Cascades. The big Cascadia event will be the West Coast event, but there also are shallow crustal faults. Further east in 1872, there was the Great North Cascades earthquake at the tip of Lake Chelan and Entiat that was felt as far east as Montana and as far south as Oregon, so the risk on the east side isn't zero. Regarding tsunamis, yes, it's a Pacific Coast issue, so I didn't take as many notes on his testimony. I did discover in my research there were some really interesting ideas out there for building vertical evacuation for our coastal towns, many of them very small, kind of the opposite of a tornado shelter. Instead of digging down to be protected, you go up. And they look like They look like fire watchtowers, only just really, really big, so that like 500 people could be standing up on top. Or you could use the roof of a building, in some cases the roof of a school, of a rebuilt school. Then the third one was liquefaction. That's when there's sandy, silty soil and it liquefies in wet areas. It kind of just turns to jello and shakes. That occurs in places that are near lakes and rivers, in valleys, places that are old. Sometimes they're just old wetlands. Then there's vulnerable building types. Unreinforced masonry, non-reinforced or under-reinforced concrete, because concrete is brittle, it breaks, it doesn't bend and flex. One of the things that the engineer said was buildings are strong until they're not. And it's not just the buildings, there are non-structural seismic hazards. 80% of building systems that are non-structural, where say the buildings can hold together, but the ceilings, everything overhead comes down, mechanical, electrical systems are just broken. And so then those buildings are not available for immediate occupation. So that's a statement of the problem from the structural engineer. From the construction manager, he really spoke to some of the trade-offs. With the money made available, do we spread to as many schools as possible for voluntary upgrades, or do we dive deep into specific schools? The current code for seismic response is to just stand long enough to get the occupants out. Doesn't address next day use, doesn't design to a level to occupy immediately. There's a committee and a guidance team is looking at the challenges of small rural schools. Should the school, as the largest public investment in that community, be a priority? Because it will be the only large public venue available for response and for recovery after an event. And then he's contrasting that kind of priority to there's 800 schools older than 1960 that are brittle. Remember, before 1960, we weren't aware of the seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest. So do we upgrade to survive the event or to be available after the event? That's another trade-off. And since a lot of interventions do require tearing off roofs, tearing open walls, if we're doing that level of innovation, do we go for full modernization grants? And that's a tough call. It's harder and harder for small districts to be able to pass the bonds and levies as costs rise for schools. Costs aren't any less in a small rural district than they are in a large district. They are, in fact, more expensive. It is more expensive to build because of distance. So what are the best ways to leverage dollars? So that was all presented to the legislature, House Ways and Means Committee, in last September. Some other ideas of, how do you prioritize upgrading for immediate occupancy? So he put the question in front of the legislature. How does OSPI work with small rural districts, small, very poor districts with a low tax base? They can't raise a lot of funds. And how do we figure out what's the best way to go forward? So the legislature was presented with that dilemma. That was the preparation for the column. And then there was reader feedback, and the bottom line is no one is in favor of buildings falling down on students at school or families sleeping. Nobody's in favor of that. We'd all like buildings to be sturdy, but as architects and structural engineers joke, it's not earthquakes that kill people, it's buildings that kill people. I also had contact from former State Senator Jim Buck from Clallam County. He is disappointed in the legislature's lack of follow-up to the DNR report. And he has joined with others to create a group called Seismic Safety for Kids. You can find the website at the same name, seismicsafetyforkids.com. Jim Buck has an engineering background, and as he and I agreed, the DNR report itself is a little hard to read for the layperson. You have to be able to read technocrat. But the hazard to his county caught his attention after the 1994 earthquake in Indonesia, the one that sent a tsunami across the Indian Ocean. Jim said, that can't happen to us, is what we think, and then we discover we don't have a better us. You can have the best stuff there is, but nature can throw more at us. So after that 2004 quake, he started paying attention and became aware of the Cascadia Subduction Zone risks in 2005. So Jim has written a series of briefing papers to translate the technical speak of the DNR report into lay language, and he and his group in the Seismic Safety for Kids, they've mailed these briefing papers with cover letters to all sitting legislators as well as to every school board in the state. Those letters went out snail mail to the school board, so they have to read them into their minutes. So every single school board is now on notice of the hazard that their school may face. Everybody knows about the risks. I'll post links to a couple of these briefing papers on my Substack. His group is working on getting them all posted and public available. Again, you can look at seismicsafetyforkids.com for those updates as they get that organized. So here's a few more notes from my conversation with Jim this past week. He's concerned that there's only a few people in his own county that are concerned about what would happen. He made a note about, in the column I noted that we built, or the engineer noted that our standard for building is to build to 3-star. A 3-star standard means you may not be able to use the building again, but it's safe to get out. If you build a school to the Japanese 5-star standard, you are back to work the next day. I mean, that means even the systems are all there. It can operate independently of the grid. It's basically it is standalone as an emergency response facility. So not only just safe for the kids, but protects the community. And that can be important, especially in some places, because as Jim pointed out, if we have the level of highway and bridge damage post Cascadia, that we certainly could, because again, our bridge and highway infrastructure has not been all been upgraded as well. We would not be able to even begin to rebuild until that road system is back together. So he's very proud that he feels that Clallam County is probably the only county in the state that has a continuous front-to-back set of planning documents recognizing all hazards. And I'm not sure about that. I was part of Spokane County's 1990s iteration of planning documents for disaster, and they're pretty thorough, but not all counties may be equally prepared. So there's a few highlights from that briefing documents. From the letter that was sent to legislators it was sent with the 4th briefing. So he points out that the first 3 briefings provided rough estimated costs to 1, replace and retrofit the deficient buildings in Washington's tsunami zones. Replace and retrofit the deficient buildings included in the report, in the seismic report, but outside of Washington's tsunami zones. And to replace and retrofit deficient buildings that were not examined in detail in the report, but looked at by date. And there's a tentative number for that. And some of those brief parts of briefing number 4, which Jim said this is the best one to take a look at. And the first one is a really big question. What is our legislative process? So here we have a problem that's going to take a lot of attention by House and Senate committees. It's not going to fit into the traditional capital budget every 2 years kind of process. It's going to take billions of dollars and years of focus to really address all of the schools, not to mention the bridges. And the legislature needs to decide how it's going to address an issue involving billions of dollars and years to completion. So here we have a legislature that operates on a 2-year basis, right? How does it stay focused for 2 decades? Big question. Issue number 2, how can we relocate tsunami schools? There are 67 buildings in tsunami zones. These buildings are only threatened by the Cascadia earthquake tsunami. Again, if you saw the pictures of that 2004 tsunami that started in Indonesia and hit beaches and towns in Thailand with no warning, while some may be retrofitted to allow students and staff to evacuate after a 7.0 quake, that would be the 3-star standard. None will survive the Cascadia tsunami. I mean, they'll be wiped out. The buildings will be wiped out. The people have to have someplace to go to be rescued. So he says the legislature needs to consider a program to use state land or acquire trade or trust land transfer state land for safe private land to locate the facilities to higher ground. Please note these rural school structures are the largest buildings in their communities and the ones best suited for emergency shelter. Relocated facilities that survive the quake will need the least repairs and facilitate early resumption of classes, as well as shelter. Earthquakes don't always happen in the summer. They can happen in January, in February, when that shelter is essential. And I tell you, when I was down at Santa Clarita at the Northridge quake, I spent a day shadowing with a building inspector who was doing post-earthquake evaluations. I've had that training as well. So we're doing these post-earthquake evaluations of buildings that people have called in and asked for someone to please come and tell us if we can go back in. Some buildings clearly needed to be red carded, no entry. Um, some buildings, it was interesting that the city of Santa Clarita had put a yellow card on their own municipal building because they needed to be able to go in and out to get emergency supplies. So they just would send people in quick and hope nothing happened while they were in there. But then there were other buildings, especially residences, where people were just worried to go back inside. And one of the biggest things about getting people safe from hypothermia, getting life back to normal, is to be able to reassure them, no, that's just a cosmetic crack in the stucco. And they were very reassured to have somebody there who had, Washington ID on the uniform, because that made them feel good that someone had come some distance to help. So that was all part of that experience. But getting people back into their buildings, houses, schools, whatever, is pretty key to getting life back to normal. So the third issue that he highlights, Jim Buck highlights, is what is our school construction standard? The School Seismic Safety Program recognizes a 5-star school construction standard rating scale. Our current UBC calls for a 3-star standard. That means student staff, 3-star means student staff should be able to evacuate with minimal injuries after the quake, but the building may not be usable without major repairs. 4-star rating means the building can be used after repairs, so it's repairable. It's not total like your car that got T-boned. A 5-star rating means the building can be used immediately. No repairs other than picking up stuff that fell over off the desks and mopping the floor. So the legislature needs to examine the cost benefit of building schools to a 4 or 5-star standard, not across the whole state, because the seismic risk is not equal across the whole state, but where the seismic risk is serious, where the community is very small, and that school may be the only building in 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 square miles to be able to be suitable to be an emergency response area, that may be a cost benefit that it makes sense. So he goes on for 8 others. Again, these are very detailed briefing papers, and I'm not going to read a bunch of them to you. But this is a group that is focused on pushing the legislature, pushing school boards to take the School Seismic Safety Program seriously, and to press forward to find what we need to be doing. One of the things Jim Buck is tracking is there's a lawsuit by Wahkiakum School District against the state of Washington for not providing adequate funding for capital facilities. Wahkiakum is it's a very poor district, median income of about 29,000, I think is what I read in one report. So you compare Wahkiakum to say Mercer Island. There's a Seattle Times article that compared the two. To raise the same amount of money, to raise the $30 million it would take for new school facilities in Wahkiakum. New school facilities. In Mercer Island, raising $30 million would be 12 cents per $1,000 assessed valuation. 12 cents. For Wahkiakum School District to do the same thing would be $4 per 1,000 valuation. Huge mismatch there, and it's why we have so many failing facilities in very small districts. They're very poor. They don't have the tax base. So what's the state's responsibility to those districts in terms of funding public education? And this is going to be interesting, the Wahkiakum case following on the McCleary's lawsuit. I'm going to follow up on that on a future column. But according to my favorite Thomas Sowell quote, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. We need to be discussing those trade-offs, and it's going to take a multi-session legislative commitment to carry through on this problem over many years. Right now, OSPI has quite logically, I'm not faulting them for that, they've quite logically just taken to adding seismic upgrades as a piece of it's a very convoluted, very bureaucratic system for funding, but it's in an attempt to be fair, and at any rate, again, a whole other topic. But they've chosen to put the seismic upgrades into the standard funding system, which requires a local bond to pass and matching funds and all these studies, and it's just not going to happen very fast. But it's logical, and if we do have indeed another 100 years, because that Cascadia fault is due to slip any time now in geological time. The last big one was January of 1700. It slips on a 300 to 500 year cycle. We are well into the 300 years, we're into the slip zone. We just don't know when it's going to happen. So now we all need to work on the trade-offs. It's sort of a Clint Eastwood moment. Do you feel lucky? Well, thank you for joining me on Forthright. Please share this to your networks and subscribe for updates on new content.